We've got a lot to learn from Indian educational systems. We've also got a lot to learn from the warp and weft of Indian life.
The education that one receives should be for the purpose of making social meaning.
In liberal arts education, you want dialogue, right? People to appreciate another point of view. You might not agree, but you need to have an acceptance that there is another point of view, and that kind of thing is very important for our society.
Thanks for showing up to this panel. I think it's going to be a bit of shift of gears from the previous discussion, which was kind of very contemporary and intense, and hopefully we'll be more reflective and think a little bit about what it takes to actually build an education infrastructure in this country. My panelists here are people who have tremendous experience, not just of teaching, running liberal arts programs, but in effect, they are pioneers in this field. Liberal arts is a relatively new concept in education in the Indian sort of context, and we want to unpack various sort of opportunities and challenges that this domain faces. And I can't think of three better people to pose a set of questions. Our moderator actually began by asking us to sort of think a little bit about what is liberal in liberal arts. But before we get to that, I think, we are living at a time when there is tremendous geopolitical change. The global economy is undergoing very large-scale shifts, both in terms of production, trade, exchange. The nature of work and employment is changing very rapidly. I think we are at an era of very accelerated technological change and development, particularly with artificial intelligence, other forms of computing, etc. All of this is, of course, capped by a climate crisis, which is not just global, but planetary. And I really want us to sort of begin, perhaps, with some reflections from all of you on what does education mean in a world where so many of the known markers are no longer around or seem to be on their way out. Because previously education had certain kinds of purposes. You were training people to be part of the clergy, part of some kind of industrial workforce or a services kind of dominated workforce. But today we are in a very different world, and I really would like to begin by perhaps asking Bhavani if you could get us started. What do you think really is the purpose of higher education today? What kind of people do we want to sort of come out of these systems to face this very uncertain and changing world?
I'll sort of probably combine multiple questions that came up now. When we say liberal education, we are looking at something that does not have any kind of indoctrination, let us say, right? Liberal in the sense of allowing free thinking, allowing learners to pursue knowledge for the sake of understanding and knowing the world through their own perspectives rather than being told what the world is. That's one. To your second question about what education is today or should be today, most often, like how you put across, learners presume that education should give them a degree, and after the degree they get a particular profession and then a career, and career today is defined more in terms of job opportunities and so on. While the education that one receives should be for the purpose of making social meaning, right? And that's the biggest challenge we have today. It's more of a culture, a refinement of the individual and how they perceive the world around them. I would like to take, the famous Plato's cave allegory here, because from time, let's say from the Greek philosophers to Indian philosophers, understanding the reality has been the key purpose of seeking knowledge. And today we understand reality from the shadows than from the reality themselves, because our perceptions are limited to what the world already has thrust upon us, rather than us seeking to know the world around us. Yeah, I'll let the other panelists respond.
Sure. Gil, you want to sort of jump in?
Can you hear me? Good. So let's not beat around the bush. When we ask the question, what is education? What does education mean now? We're speaking specifically about what has education meant in India and the India higher education scene. for the longest time, education has largely meant training. And it's a training that is an inheritance from a British colonial system, which was designed to produce compliant subjects who would shut up and do what they were told and reproduce what had been given to them. The literal meaning of education, or at least in terms of its etymological derivation, is not training, but to lead out, to get outside of oneself. And I think in this day and age where we're confronting so many crises, such as the ones Srinath mentioned, the planetary crisis of climate change, but also radical change, where every day, and not just because of the current political crisis, but in terms of larger shifts that are reorganizing the way in which we relate to each other, the way in which we acquire knowledge, the way in which we produce knowledge. We're taking on board the overwhelming challenge of AI, for instance. What we need is not a citizenry that simply reproduces what it's been told, but people who are capable of thinking out of the box, having been led out by their education from the straight and narrow path of, say, a kunji, something that you can mug up by rote learning and reproduce, so that colonial masters can pat you on the head and say, good. Tayyib Salih, in his novel Season of Migration to the North, has one of his main characters, a brilliant young Sudanese man, say, the English came, gave us the gift of education, and what did it consist of? Teaching us to say yes. And we've got to make sure that we are creating classroom environments in which students are doing more than simply putting their heads down and saying, yes, sir, where they're capable of thinking afresh, in original, in out-of-the-box ways in order to problem solve. And sometimes problem solving doesn't mean arriving at a final answer, but learning how to ask questions better. I often say to my students, please don't rush to the answer. That's not where you're going to find the learning. Please stay on the left-hand side of the question mark. Keep evaluating what the question is. Question the question. And that way, you might be able to get a perspective that is an education in the literal sense, that leads you out of an impasse, a cul-de-sac, a dead end, that dooms us simply to reproduce the same mistakes over and over again in the name of being compliant.
Sudheesh?
Thanks, Jonathan, and thanks, Srinath. So, to your question on what is the purpose of education and how do we interpret it, the purpose in today's context, I think the more things change, the more they remain the same. What I mean by that is, if we go right down from the Kothari Commission down to the latest Kasturi Rangan's report on the national education policy, the purpose of education has remained the same. It is about the physical, intellectual, moral, and spiritual development of the student, right? I mean, that I don't think has changed. Whether AI or no AI, I think that fundamentally remains the same. That's my first point. The second is, of course, there is an instrumental reason for education to exist, which is to prepare people for jobs. And the nature of those jobs is changing dramatically, and we can talk more about it in the later part of the panel. And therefore, probably education is not a finishing school for a job tomorrow, but actually what Jonathan was also referring to is the learning how to learn. You have to continuously, because if your careers are going to shift 5 or 6 times in the next 30 years, or probably even more, you have to repivot because of the nature of change. And for that, the only skill that you will have is the ability to learn. So perhaps education is how you learn to learn. Lastly, and because I represent the Azim Premji Foundation, the Azim Premji University, I would sort of also draw attention to this whole purpose of education to build good citizens, right? I mean, who's a good citizen, right? Somebody who is as aware of the duties as of his or her rights, somebody who understands the values of our constitution, you know, justice, equity, humaneness, so on and so forth. One can go on, right? Now, how do we build such citizens, you know, who can uphold the values of this country? That's the purpose of education, and that, I think, remains the same.
Thanks. Gil, you mentioned about the Indian particular context, the colonial inheritance of education. You also quite rightly emphasized, you know, what the etymology of education is. You know, and I was reminded of the fact that, you know, even the etymology of the word liberal, which we use as an adjective here, is actually quite interesting because it has many roots, as you would know. I mean, liberalis in Latin, by which we mean the liberal arts, but liber itself means free, or to be freedom. There is an, OED tells me that there's an Old English word called leodan, which means to grow. So there's freedom and the idea of growth. But very interestingly, and I think particularly for an Indian audience, there is a older Greek word called eleutheros, which means freedom, which also contributes to the etymology of liberal. But the oldest is actually a Sanskrit word, and I'm not saying this in some nativist spirit, but Sanskrit is an Indo-European language. There is a verb called rodhati, which actually means to rise or to grow. So the idea of growth and freedom seems to be central to this idea of liberal education, and I think that's something that perhaps, you know, you were pointing out. But it still remains that the particular models of liberal education that you all, when you started out on your ventures here in India, were looking at were very American. They came from a certain moment in the United States' own history, which is the Cold War period, post-Second World War, expansion of education as a result of the GI Bill, coming up of new campuses. You know, there is a certain sense that you want to educate people to understand the Western civilization and its ideals and so on. So when you looked at that and said that, you know, we somehow have to get growth and freedom as the core values, but we need to transpose this model into India. What were you thinking, and how did you sort of really start thinking about it?
I remember when Ashoka started, the PR team had come up with this, this branding slogan, which we all shuddered at, which was an Ivy League education here in India. And my immediate response was, why does it have to be Ivy League? Why can't we have an Indian education here in India? Why do we have to reinvent a wheel that may have suited a certain historical and cultural moment in the West, but which might not ride as comfortably here? I think it's worth keeping in mind that even though liberal arts as a phrase may be a relative newcomer in the Indian higher education scene, there's in fact a long tradition of something like the liberal arts in India. And as you suggested, with the Sanskrit word that is adjacent to our ideas of the liberal. When we look at the early Buddhist educational institutions, Nalanda, Takshila, there is an emphasis there on knowledge produced through Shastra, through discussion, through argument, through dialectics. Not through reproducing what the teacher says, but through questioning. And I think this is something that we've long been aware of, that it's something that I encountered with sort of destabilizing force when I first came to India. I noticed that in the classroom, the students that I was teaching at DU Jadapur when I first came would be very polite and respectful. Whenever I asked questions, hands wouldn't go up. As soon as I walked out the classroom, I'd be accosted by these same students who wanted to argue with me. So there was something about the classroom space that had anesthetized the students' ability to think on their feet and ask questions. Once I got them outside, that tradition of Shastra, what Amartya Sen calls the argumentative Indian, I confronted with sometimes exuberant and boisterous force. I wanted to say, you needn't be so argumentative, but I loved it. I think our challenge at Ashoka has been to say, what are the best practices globally that we can try to implement? But also, equally, what are the traditions that we can tap into here? So we're not simply photocopying a model tout court from the West. And I think, frankly, there is an enormous amount that the subcontinent can teach the rest of the world about a liberal arts education, about the arts of Shastra, about the arts of, in particular, being able to live side by side with many different perspectives and somehow put them in dialogue with each other. Not in a fight to the death, but in a sort of noisy acceptance that there is not one singular answer to many of the questions we have. I think the best liberal arts education I've received in India is not in any university, but going to the bazaar. Every time I go there, I can't speak a Shuddh Hindi or English. I have to keep moving between different languages. Most of us are familiar with the experience of starting a thought in one language and finishing it in another. Now, I'd like to think that that is the basis of a liberal education, that one has to keep moving in response to a world that is full of variety and difficulty and complexity. If one stays in only one lane, one's going to encounter miscomprehension and danger. I'm always laughing about the lanes that are painted on the roads here in India because they presume that drivers will, stay in their lane. That's a very Western ideal. Of course, as we all know from driving here in India, if you stay in one lane, you're going to crash. You have to keep moving. And it's the same thing in education. You have to keep shifting your perspective in order to enrich, complicate, and challenge your assumptions about the world. Otherwise, it'll be a car crash. So we've got a lot to learn from Indian educational systems. We've also got a lot to learn from the warp and weft of Indian life, even in its dangerous roads.
Sudheesh, I recognize Ashoka University is somewhat overrepresented here. So I really want to sort of, ask a pointed question about your experience in Azim Premji University. There has been a lot of interesting attempts at curriculum development. You try and attract students from very diverse sets of backgrounds. Could you just share a little bit about what kinds of curricular sort of experiments have happened within your university space and how you think that has benefited the students that you've seen pass through?
Yeah, thanks, Srinath. It's about 12 years since the Azim Premji University started its undergrad program, which is a liberal arts program. And we've had our successes and failures like any other system, right? Now, when we started this, of course, the models came from the West. Liberal arts and the benefits of liberal arts education was very evident in the West, and we did look at those. And one of the things, for instance, that guided us was the interdisciplinarity of issues, right? I mean, the way the world is changing, the problems are interdisciplinary in nature, right? The problems are also wicked problems, if you take climate, for instance, right? You can't solve it with one discipline. It requires multiple disciplines to come together. And a liberal arts education sort of does that, right? So one of the thoughts that was guiding us is interdisciplinarity is the way of life, and therefore we should do this. Some of those cases were already made, like economics with mathematics, right? That's already a known case, right? But biology with computer science, let's say, that was not 12 years ago such an evident argument, right? But today, if you see the kind of jobs that are emerging in biology or even in law, a lot of them have got to do with computer science, right? So the first reason why we believed such a liberal arts education is necessary is because of the change that we are seeing in the world. Now, in terms of how we structure the courses, right? I mean, we could have done the standard streaming of courses, right? You know, you could have done the physics, chemistry, mathematics, physics, chemistry, biology, whatever, the standard streaming that was there in Indian education. But we said, look, you know, why don't we distribute the credits in such a way that people develop fundamental skills? And what are these fundamental skills? The first one is reasoning, right? I mean, of course, you will assume that people already know a bit of numeracy, a bit of language, and a little bit of analytical skills. But reasoning, public reasoning particularly, right? Now that's something that you have to develop. You have to develop an appreciation for art and aesthetics. You have to understand India. I mean, if you have to work in the future, then you can't be just a mathematician or just a physicist. You need to have these abilities as well. So therefore, our course structure sort of has a mix of all this with a lot of weightage for these kind of courses. The last one is, I'm taking off from what Jonathan said, is, you know, in liberal arts education, you want dialogue, right? People to appreciate another point of view. You might not agree, but you need to have an acceptance that there is another point of view, and that kind of thing is very important for our society, right? Now, how do you develop that? If people come with a certain disciplinary loyalty that, look, all solutions are found in science and there is nothing out there in humanities, that's a recipe for disaster, right? How do you develop in students this ability to see that there is another point of view? And that is also part of our education.
Bhavani, if I could build on the point which Sudheesh made, you know, which is about what does a liberal arts education give you apart from, you know, disciplinary knowledge of various things and so on. I'm sure it's a common experience for all of us. Come admissions time, you have friends whose kids are ready to go to college, calling you up and saying, listen, you're at Ashoka, you know, my kid wants to go there, but what are they ever going to do after getting this, you know, 4 years of liberal arts education? What is that going to prepare them for? So, I mean, how do you typically respond to concerns of parents and perhaps even employers and others about why should we come to Christ and pick up students for our workforce, or parents about why they should send them? I mean, what is the case beyond the intellectual case?
Right. Thank you for that question. In fact, I was about to take off from where Sir stopped about humanities and the relevance of humanities in today's education. The problem lies in, you know, putting them in compartments and saying this is the discipline of science and this is the discipline of humanities and so on. And allowing a free flow of, you know, thought between the two domains is actually the way forward. I'll just give a couple of examples from my own classes. As a literature teacher myself, when I walk into a class, let's say of a science combination, or of commerce and management combination, it's very hard to get them to understand why they're reading literature, right? Most of the time their question is, I don't have to know this. I know I'll get placed in this particular organization, and why should I know this particular author or this story, or why will this play have any impact at all in my life? And it's very difficult to break that notion that students are already pre-programmed to think. And I cannot blame them, because that's how the society is, that's how the world is, perspectives are shaped over many years. I'll give an example of this poem by Robert Frost. I'm sure it's a common, familiar poem, Birches, right? In that poem, Frost recalls his childhood memory of how a birch branch, which is hanging very low, he uses that to swing and to sway. And in that poem, he brings a metaphor for life itself by talking about how necessary it is for that little boy to hold the branch tight enough, and then to launch himself. And if he launches himself too fast or too slow, he's not going to be able to gather momentum, right? On one side it is science, on one side it is philosophy. And when I took this to the science class, spoke to them about momentum, speed, direction, and so on, and then brought the philosophy of life, it made much more sense to them to relate to that component. While literature brings so much of these life lessons alongside, the philosophies that exist underneath them, man has, let's say, humanity in general, there is a human need much beyond what the discipline can give us, right? And those human needs, like how both of them just mentioned, are life skills, what we call today, and in the name of life skills, we say we do these many credits of this course, and your life skill is done. No, life skill cannot be done that way. And life skills are, in fact, perspectives that we develop over a period of time by reading texts of this kind, by intensely engaging in texts of that kind. For example, when we allow students to ask questions, I think all of us in the panel, and I'm sure our audience also would agree, when I take a literature class, I go to the class, give them a piece of poem or a story, and ask them to generate as many questions as they can from that text. That works wonders. Then I go to the class and say, this has a gender reading, this has a race reading, this has so-and-so underpinnings, and so on. But if I allow them to bring out as many questions as they can. So is the case with any of the research scholars when they come for their PhD. They say, this is my title, this is my objective, this is what I'm going to find. Where is the research? What are you going to research about? So I tell them, scrap all this, come back to me with 25 questions tomorrow on why you're doing, what you're doing, how you're going to do this. 25 questions, and they say, I'm going to change my mind on this because my questions have led me to further questions and to a further deeper understanding of what I want to pursue. And then I tell them, okay, come back with 50 more questions tomorrow. And when they come with more and more questions, that's when they are actually researching on that particular topic. I would also like to talk about what Dr. Sudheesh mentioned in terms of logic and reasoning. Most often, logic and reasoning is looked at as an entrance exam requirement. There's an entrance exam, pick all the book on logic and reasoning, and here you go. But syllogism should be, part of every education, I feel, because, deductive reasoning or reasoning of any kind, logic, and such a thought frame, if it is integrated in any of the courses, by default, it allows the learners to think, to come up with, their own solutions, look at logically how something works and does not work. And that is when the larger human needs, which I was talking about, for example, our own existential angst, our own questions about what we are doing, purpose, meaning making, all of that will become more settled and not confused if we pursue knowledge in this format. Thank you.
I just want to shift the focus of our conversation a little beyond questions around pedagogy, intellectual aspects of it, to talk a little bit more on the institutional side. And maybe, Gil, I could kind of, begin with you again. One of the interesting things about the emergence, it seems to me, of these liberal arts kind of universities and programs across India, and not just those of you representing universities to which we belong, is the sort of co-evolution of this with the rise of Indian philanthropy itself. Indian philanthropy has come into its own in a pretty big way over pretty much the same time that many of these universities are. There are different philanthropic models which have supported these universities. I mean, you have on the one hand, example of the Azim Premji Foundation, which is perhaps India's largest philanthropic foundation, but you also have others like Kriya and Ashoka, which have a collaborative philanthropic model and have many other. So it seems to me that in these kinds of institutional spaces, you have many more stakeholders to deal with. Previously, if you are in a public university or in a government college, you had to deal with the authorities, as it were. I mean, they still are, and they still control a lot. But there are other stakeholders. Unlike, say, more mature models in the West that you refer to, we don't have governance by alumni. Our alumni are still making their way in the world. So I'm just wondering, I mean, could you talk a little bit about the challenges of a multiple stakeholder environment within which these universities have to operate?
It's a really good question because I'm not sure there is one answer, which is a liberal arts answer. We're still seeing the experiment of Ashoka, the experiment of Azim Premji, Kriya, all these other new private universities unfolding. I think there are certain profound advantages with the multiple stakeholder philanthropic model. One is, and I'm talking here about Ashoka, not other private universities. One is that you don't have a single person or family controlling the institution. You have multiple founders, all of whom have an equal vote, which creates an ethos of discussion, conflict resolution amongst the managing body that one would hope would trickle down to the institution as a whole. That ethos of dialogue is absolutely crucial. But it's also interesting, and it's a potential liability too, compared to the old liberal arts model of art for art's sake, where one studies not to become a liberal, but because one is already liberalis, i.e. a free person from a high class, not a woman or a servant. One has the time and the means to study whatever one wants, right? And what we have with these philanthropically funded universities are people from the corporate sector, by and large, who are themselves employees, who are responding to what they perceive to be a crisis in the higher education system. These are people who want to hire fresh graduates. And what they've found is that the conveyor belt of IIT graduates, of business school graduates, are producing people who are incapable of thinking, who are incapable of being versatile, who are incapable of asking questions, who are incapable of working in groups. And so, yes, we have a Western liberal arts model, but it is allied with a fairly explicit demand that has come from employers. I sometimes jokingly refer to this as the neoliberal arts college, where the demands of capitalism and their demands that we have to heed at our peril. We can't just say to our students, don't think about what happens afterwards, everything will work out. Sab kuch theek hoga. We can't say that. We've got to train our students for the reality of a very complex world, and one that is very different from the world that their parents were educated in. Often when I'm speaking with students, I feel like I'm simultaneously talking with their parents, that their parents are also in the office with me, because they are saying, yes, but I need to major in this in order to get this career for life. That's not how the world is working right now. As has been pointed out, one can now expect to change one's career multiple times. One needs to be versatile. One needs to be in possession of more than simply one-size-fits-all toolkit. And I think what has been serendipitous about the emergence of entrepreneurs, corporate types in the funding of universities is an awareness of the reality of a changing job market that can still be compatible with what, slightly more idealistic people like me might believe in terms of educating a citizenry, of educating people into the ethics of getting outside oneself, rather than simply saying yes and reproducing what authority has told you to be the truth. I think one of the big problems we're facing right now, this is the last thing I'll say, in the age of the internet, students are forgetting how to read. Right now, you can go to the internet to find out anything like that. And so the task of reading has been increasingly eclipsed by the easy fix of downloading information. But reading is not the same as downloading. And the problem with downloading information is you often can't discern what's the difference between good, useful information, and what is absolute balderdash. Reading forces you to slow down. It forces you to enter into the shoes of another. It forces you to think about, how do things look like from a perspective different from mine? How has the world been created in a way radically different from what I assume to be the case? Now, that is not just a cognitive challenge, it's also an ethical one. And I fear that our universities, to the extent that they still abide by the model of teach for the test and rote learning, are producing highly unethical students. Because the incentive is to simply, as they say, crack the exam. Not to get out of yourself, not to think, what's it like to be another person? If you're trained as an engineer, you can build a bridge, but you don't think, what will it mean for a bridge to be built here, to affect this community, that they may be displaced or that they may be helped by the bridge? These are the types of questions that I think a philanthropically minded mass stakeholder group of funders can help us take cognizance of.
Sure. Sudheesh, I want to sort of focus not so much on the experience of the foundation and the university, but on an aspect of institutional life that Gil referred to, which I think is technology. And we've seen some dramatic changes just in the last 3-4 years with AI tools becoming so easily available to our students. You know, Gil spoke about reading. I mean, I think AI tools disincentivize reading even more because it gives you some ready-made kind of ways of getting around difficult texts and so on. I'm just wondering, what do you think is the sort of, you know, potential role of AI in a liberal education? Is it going to be the undoing of this ideal, or do you think it can further it in other ways?
Srinath, if you permit, can I just give a counterpoint to
Yes,
what
of course,
Jonathan
please.
said?
Yeah. We have, I mean, I hope we have the time, so yeah,
Okay.
please.
So while Jonathan made the case for a multi-stakeholder university, ours is a very different scenario, right? It's a single stakeholder university. Now, it is very difficult to create single stakeholder universities in the country because of the size of the investment that is required, right? Very few philanthropists will have that scale of capital and the patience that is required to go along with that capital to create a university, right? So therefore, possibly, you know, there are going to be more multi-stakeholder universities than single stakeholder university. That said, you know, with a single stakeholder university, there are some advantages, right? One is clearly continuity, right? Continuity of thought and the stability that comes along with it. And if the stakeholder has a purity of purpose, and in our case, we have made some fundamental choices, right? For example, we are not a very research-focused university. We are a teaching-led university. That's a fundamental choice you need to make. We are very focused on providing education to the most marginalized in India. That comes with its own set of consequences, and we have made that choice consciously, right? Now, all these things you could do if the single stakeholder is very clear on what is it that she or he is backing, right? So that's just a counterpoint to what you said. Now to your question, Srinath, which is, you know, on how is technology revolutionizing things on the ground with students? Well, I think we are also discovering the path. I don't think we have any pat solutions as yet. You know, in the initial first 1 or 2 years, it was all about how do you control for plagiarism and stuff like that, and that phase is now over. But now the questions are, look, with everything that can be now created through whatever, you know, ChatGPT and stuff like that, the challenge for the teacher in the classroom has become immense. You know, how do you set a test? How do you assess a student? How do you develop these fundamental abilities that we are talking of when there are such easy paths outside? This is not a solution that we have discovered as yet, Srinath. So I'm sorry, I may have to disappoint you.
No, that's perfectly fine. And, you know, we have governance structures, we have technology, but Bhavani, a very important part of any educational institution are the students themselves. And I just want to end this conversation by just asking you your thoughts. You refer to a very important facet of their lives and experience, which is anxiety. You know, it is almost existential in a Heideggerian sense. It's there, it is continuously part of it. Anxiety can be an asset, but it can also be problematic. I think it's fair to say that, you know, we see it manifesting itself in terms of mental health challenges across the spectrum. I mean, we are all learning it literally day by day about what are the kinds of things. So what do you think universities like ours need to do in order to become spaces where freedom and growth, the true things that we identified as core to this enterprise, can flourish in this age of existential anxiety?
I'll loop this with the AI component because that's what is shaping the generation today. Easy access to information, as well as when we say reading has come down to a great extent. It is not just reading, but it is also processing of that information and reproducing that information in different forms, right? That has come down too. Because when we read something, we have our own ways of representing that information, putting down that information or expressing that to other people, or navigating with that information and creating new knowledge. That's going to be the lack of the future because AI does all of it. AI does the reading for you, puts it in various formats for you, and you just have to see the summaries coming out in different formats and does not allow one to think. And, you know, like Darwin's theory, I think there's going to be that, you know, backward evolution where we lose some skill or some cognitive capabilities in the process of dependency on AI or technology for that matter. That is where the existential angst comes because man, you know, or humans in general are driven to think, right? We exist because we think. And if we don't think, then we cease to exist because others are doing the thinking for us. Others have given us the thought framework and we live by that format or that label that is created by the world around us. And when we fail to think or to produce new knowledge or to create something original, then we lack. And that is why the entire existential angst comes. Today, anxiety, largely student anxiety, is because there is this inability or lack or gap in that thinking that one needs to do.
Okay, I know we are kind of out of time here, but do we have some time for questions from the floor? Yeah, maybe a couple I could see. There's a lady there. I can see your hand. Can we please get a mic to her?
Hello. Yeah.
Hi.
Yeah, yeah.
Hi, sir. Thank you for the views on interdisciplinary framework. That is very much needed. And my question to you, Jonathan, sir, in your experience, we already, as an educator, we have seen this fragmented and polarized viewpoints. So should we not inculcate this liberal education from the early age? What would be the challenge, and also with a bias-free pedagogy, and so that an individual have a freedom to choose rather than a pushed political ideologies?
Thank you for that question. I mean, for me, it's less about indoctrination by political ideologies than it is a more, shall we say, pervasive, systematic indoctrination into the board exam culture. I think it's the best named education system, because what can leave you more bored than the board exam and its preparation? It really saddens me when we do interviews for Ashoka. I always ask people, what have you read over the last few years that has stuck with you, that has transformed you, that has made you ask questions of the world? And it's extraordinary how many students say to me, but sir, I haven't read. I haven't read for 5 years because I've had to crack the board exam. So I think you're absolutely right that we're not going to fix the problems of education by simply offering something neat and shiny at the tertiary level. There needs to be a comprehensive thinking, rethinking of what education is right from the beginning. And I think some of the anxiety that Srinath was asking about and that Bhavani was addressing actually emerges from the experience that many of our children have of going through the years from 14 to 17 in what is basically a high-pressure sausage machine. When they come to Ashoka, basically they have to spend the first year unlearning what they're being conditioned to do in order to be a good student from the point of view of the board exam. But that conditioning has made them invest way too much in being perfect in terms of their grade. So they find it often hard to get a grade that is less than what they think is the highest grade. It's also disabled their ability to regard the other people in the classroom as resources rather than as competitors. And this was something I noticed particularly when we all came back from the COVID pandemic. I think COVID has done untold damage to a young generation in ways we've not taken stock of. The kids who spent their last 2 years at school, their board exam years, in lockdown, getting classes over Zoom, turned up at Ashoka incapable of looking each other in the eye because they had been stuck at home in Zoom rectangles, thinking that education is simply about the painful acquisition of commodities that you spit back. The social intelligence that is a vital part of being an adolescent had completely gone. And I think we ignore this at our peril. We've got to ask, what is our high school exam system producing in terms of the demands it places on our students, on our children, the pressures it places on them, the way in which it makes them think any shortcut is to be desired. It actually, I think, actively encourages a climate of cheating. It encourages a kind of vicious competitive spirit, which sees education as a zero-sum pie. If I get a good grade, then other people won't. Or if someone else gets a good grade, there's less for me. We've got to find ways of thinking also not just about the etymology of education and liberal, but the etymology of university, which means it's related to universitas, which means not just the universe, but fellowship amongst a collective. Not just every subject, but everyone who is part of the association of a university, that we're working together to lift everyone up. Again, this is part of the ethical imperative. And if we're not teaching that at the high school level, then it's almost impossible to rebuild the barn that has been burnt at that point. So I think your question is absolutely the right one to be asking. Thank you.
One of you can answer. What is the role of experiential education in the world's future? That anybody can answer. Why I am asking this question is, I found in Japan, the best education for the children, the Japanese are giving. Because children are growing up in a way. When I found the world have lot of boundaries, I said I don't believe in boundaries. So when I said that I will go to Pakistan, Pakistan radio announced visa. That is a new education experience. In China, 4 years ago, when I landed in Beijing, the driver of the car told me, India and China have two great civilizations. What is the role for civilizations, for experience, for better humanity in the future?
Just one brief question, sir.
I think that will need a full panel on its own, so back to you. Thanks. Yeah. I think you'll need to give us another 45 minutes to answer that question. I mean, if we have the time, we can go for it. Yeah.
I mean, I could only get a part of your question, sir. What is the role of experiential education in the future? That how critical and important would it be is how I've understood it. If my understanding is right, I think its importance is going to remain as much as it was before. I don't think there is a substitute for that. And there is also, you know, it is not an either-or situation. You know, you have experiential education, but no classroom-based conceptual training. No, I mean, you need both, and both have a place, and I don't think that's going to change in the future. Thank you.